So yeah, let's talk about Christianity's image problem. It's interesting. I wrote that book in 2019, and then since then I've been looking at some of the data on kind of where Christianity is, and it's actually much worse than I suspected. When you look at the data, you learn things like there's one study that said over 1 million people that identify as Christians today are leaving the faith, and so over the next 40 years there'll be about 32 to 40 million people.
In the West?
This is about Americans, that particular study. So just many, many people leaving. For every person that becomes a Christian, 4 leave the faith. There's been a trend to now Gen Z and millennials. There's a trend down. Many are not sharing their faith, and they actually think it's morally wrong to share or to try to convert someone to your point of view. So we have these trends. We've got a backdoor problem. People are leaving the faith. We've got a front door problem. People aren't sharing the gospel. And then if you think about the house itself, it's all in disarray. And so what is the image problem, and how do I kind of think about it with those three terms? Yeah, with the Christian voice, the idea is that nobody cares what we have to say anymore. We've lost touch with the relevancy of Jesus to all aspects of life. And so we're largely anti-intellectual, like the culture. And so nobody wants to hear from us. That's the Christian voice. When you think about the Christian conscience, and you look at, for us, many of us are just as fragmented as our non-believing neighbors. And weekly, as you know, I'm sure, we read of like Christian leaders that disqualify themselves from ministry. And so if you kind of look at that, the problem is that the church is no longer able to perform her prophetic function that we've historically been called to do.
Billy Graham being able
to speak light into culture.
Yeah.
And then with the Christian imagination, the idea there is just that we, as Christians, largely view the world the same way everyone else does. And so the way that I typically think about this is we describe the world as everyday or mundane or ordinary. But if you think about it, that's the exact opposite. The world is enchanted. The world is mysterious. The world is gift. Or to use the proper theological term, the world is sacred. It's part of this universe gifted to us, or this reality gifted to us from God. And so add all this up, we've lost the Christian voice, Christian conscience, Christian imagination. As a result, for many in culture, they look at Christianity or Jesus and the gospel and they think it's just not plausible, it's just not desirable, or both. You asked earlier, what is this disenchantment? What is this disenchanted way of viewing the world? So I think the word disenchantment, sometimes there's Charles Taylor who wrote a big book called This Secular Age. It's 800-page book. But what he means by the secular age is we now live in this age of contested belief where belief in God is difficult and unbelief is possible. If you go back 500 years, almost everyone believed that God exists.
You had to believe.
Yeah, and it was really hard to disbelieve. Yeah. Today, not so. We live in a secular age, and the word I prefer to use is disenchanted. And basically what I mean by that is it's about a kind of perception. So we no longer perceive the world in its proper light. So think of it, in fact, theologians talk about a disenchanted perception as a kind of idolatry. Okay. So on the flip side of that, to your question of what do we do, the phrase that keeps coming back to me in my own thinking, well, there's two phrases. One is to begin to understand God and then all things in relation to God. So everything that we see is, of course, created, it's creature. And so it illuminates something about God, and it's dependent on God, and it's sustained by God, and it's lovingly cared for by God. And so if we could learn to see, so the other phrase that I keep coming back to is that we would learn to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And so I think that's kind of the idea of re-enchantment, that we would see the world in kind of with this theological lens, see God truly, and then all things in relation to God, because in fact that's the reality we find ourselves in.
I wonder if what screws me up there is that I have almost an interventionist only understanding of God sometimes.
Yeah, right.
I'll step in and do something and then step out and then step in and then step out.
Yep.
And that's a little too physical to be right, but as opposed to you were using words like sustaining.
Yes.
This is here because God
is right here too.
And so it's that's hard for me to for my mind to process. But I can see how if that was your everyday filter, how that would make the world a little. You use the word mysterious.
So this actually comes to the imagination piece, because I suspect that you imagine yourself in this world the way that we've been taught since the Enlightenment. And that, since the Enlightenment, the view of the universe that we've been gifted is this idea that we live in this mechanical, clockwork, machine-like world where you have pure nature, kind of like a box, and then you have
physics.
Yep, all the the little atoms moving in the void, bumping into each other. And then above that, you have the supernatural realm. Yeah. And then you mentioned and God from time to time will kind of intervene in there. And then closes the door and he's back up in his realm. And that's not the dominant way of conceiving reality for the first 1,500 years of the world, of the church. Nor do I think that that's the proper way, just sort of like biblically speaking. I think that maybe to use one phrase, to think about the sacramental universe that we actually find ourselves in, as one theologian puts it, we live in a grace-infused world. Where there's a tight connection between the natural order and what I would call the sacred order. So everything here in this universe points to and illuminates something in the divine realm. And then the divine realm, God, participates in everything that we find here. So it's very, very tight connection. Sometimes they call it the sacred cord that connects, the two realms. And so, I think the ancient way of viewing the world, like C.S. Lewis would talk about the medieval worldview as a kind of cathedral. And I think that that's a better, maybe, mental image. Or Calvin talked about the heavens and the earth as a dazzling theater of God's glory. And I think that's a better image than like the clockwork, impersonal pushes and pulls of the laws of nature.
Yeah, it's funny how if I'm just a little bit off there in my theology, that completely colors the world differently.
Right, and that's just at the level of our imagining ourselves too. I mean, it's the mind too, but it's also this is how we conceive of our place in the universe. Yeah.
But what you're saying is the reason why, in part, so many are leaving is simply because we're imagining the world differently. Just something that simple.
Yep. Yeah, how do we see ourselves and how do we locate our place in a world created by God is actually a really important question theologically. And if we do conceive of it as pure nature or as a grand clock, of which we're just, a bunch of atoms, or as like the materialist likes to say, we're nothing but organized mud, as one puts it, or nothing but the atoms. No, that's actually not. We're something much more mysterious, something much more fundamental, something much more united than just a collection of atoms. Of course, we have atoms as parts, but we're bodies and souls united in these, these fundamental unities called substances in my area, philosophy. But the point is, the reality is much more complicated than this sort of mechanical picture that we've been gifted from the Enlightenment.
Yeah, that's where I need a little bit more help. It just goes to show you how much culture disciples us without us even knowing.
That's right.
I guess is having to consciously fight against that and see. I don't know if you have any advice. That's maybe a bad way to put it, because I'm sure it's just like you just have to start seeing the world biblically at some point. That's the advice. But I don't know if there's any habits of the mind that might help us see the world.
Yeah, I think that's
a more enchanted way. Infused with, I think, like that cathedral-like way.
I think that's a great question, because there are things. I mean, so Dallas Willard, in The Divine Conspiracy, he wrote in chapter 3, which I would point all your listeners, if you're listening to that chapter, it's very challenging, where he says if we're going to be like Christ, and if we're going to take on the mind of Christ, then we need to see the world the way Jesus does. And how does Jesus see the world? He sees it as God bathed and God permeated. And then he says something really challenging. Unless we see the world the way Jesus does, we cannot basically, faithfully follow him, or something like really challenging to me. And so I think part of what, the practical things we need to do is to dig into the world of Scripture consistently, daily, often, and study it. Dig into and then see our study as part of our discipleship unto Christ, so that we can, as we study the molecule, what does that teach us about the God of the molecule? As we study the manatee over in the coast, what does that teach us about the God of the manatee? As we study the laws of logic, what does that teach us about the perfectly rational God who's behind that? And so as we begin to kind of cultivate those habits of minds, and we will begin to see the world the way Jesus does, and then delight, which is this emotion, we'll begin to delight in it the way Jesus does as well.
It's the compartmentalization of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. It takes a lot of conscious effort.
Yeah, it takes work.
Okay. Well, obviously we need to have a conversation with our culture
Yeah.
about the gospel, but how do we, so what you're basically telling us is that the gospel has lost its hearing. It no longer has
we've
a
lost our
hearing.
voice.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to hear from us because they don't take us seriously anymore.
Yeah.
And partly that's our fault. I think that's a part of it's that we're just not the kinds of people that are attractive to the world. We're intellectually shallow, we're morally fragmented, and so on. Part of it, of course, is we need to make sure we make the case for the goodness, truth, and beauty of the gospel. Yeah.
Do you think part of the mistake we made is we focused on the truth and we left out the beauty and the goodness?
Yeah.
In our sort of response to culture's shift?
I think that, I would never want to say it's a mistake to merely defend the truth, but I do think there's a sense in which we're cutting off all the resources that we have to defend the goodness, truth, and beauty of the gospel by merely walking that plank of reason. So my thinking is, today in our culture, in this disenchanted world, in this secular age, however we want to kind of understand it, there are objections to the rationality of Christianity. And so for those, we do need to continue. And of course, any apologetic, any cultural apologetic worth its salt has to engage the truth and the reasonableness of the faith. But my suggestion is there's all these other objections to the faith today, to the goodness, to the beauty, to the desirability of the gospel. And if we don't also address those, we're just not addressing people as people.
Yeah, as a whole person.
As a whole. And that's where I want to just expand what I would call the planks that we build to build the bridge.
Yeah.
From culture, from our Athens to Jesus and the gospel.
Well, I've made that mistake numerous times. It's just so, because there are people who will say it is, I find it reasonable, but not desirable.
That's right.
Or you'll have people who say
way.
it's desirable, but it's unreasonable.
That's right.
And you've
got to do both.
You have to, exactly. Yeah, that's helpful. So how do we, well, I think you emphasize desire as a way of re-enchanting.
One provocative comment by one apologist, she said that disenchantment deadens desire, and the world doesn't even know what they're missing. And I think that's relevant here. So it tells us that there's nothing beyond this world. This is like the disenchanted age. It tells us there is no God, there's no transcendent meaning, there's no purpose to this world. So it kind of deadens these desires, and we look for, like, I don't know, pleasure is usually now the view of happiness. And so that's one thing. The second thing is, one reason why desires are so important is because we do want to respect people as whole people. And as many philosophers and theologians have noted, we are desiring animals, that we long for things. We have passions that move us. And the three great longings that can function as starting points for anybody are the deep-seated, God-created longings for truth, goodness, and beauty. God has given us a mind, and it longs for truth. God has given us a conscience, and it longs for goodness. And then God has given us the imagination, and it's on a quest for beauty. And then if you put your theological cap on and say, well, what is the source of goodness, truth, and beauty? The answer is Christ. One of my favorite quotes from Augustine's Confessions is in Book 3, but he says, of God, you are the beauty of all beautiful things. And then he says, you are the good of all good things. And I would just add, you are the truth in which all true things point. And so I think we can use the desires as starting points. Like Paul did in Athens, he identified these idols to the unknown God, and he used that as a starting point to build a bridge. So that's the second thing I'd want to say. The third thing, which I'm not sure if you were asking this, but I'll just throw it out there, is there is actually a really cool argument from desire, or one specific desire for God, or for transcendence, to the reality of God's existence. And C.S. Lewis and many others have articulated that. So there is actually a cool argument from desire to God.
Give us a quick summary of it?
Yeah,
that would
really
be
simple.
It would be new to me, and I would, I think it would help with all of this.
Right.
Because it gives some structure to it.
Yeah, and I think it's important because we are so moved by our loves today, especially in this culture. We've got to engage our desires. So here's a quick argument.
I'm like, I just am an emotionless person, and that's my mom's fault.
But you're not. You're just not aware.
Arm and my mom would just go, get a cup of water, you're fine.
That's right.
So I just had that childhood. So I'm just like, I don't.
Yeah, like what's going on here? So here's a quick, C.S. Lewis famously develops the argument from desire, and I'll just point the three.
What book is that in?
There's three places where he gives one. The most easy to access is the chapter on hope in Mere Christianity, and that's the one I'll quickly summarize. And then he also does it from beauty to God, but it's still this transcendent desire in his essay, The Weight of Glory. And then he does it in a third place in the appendix to Pilgrim's Regress, which was one of the first books he wrote after he converted. But the argument is really simple. It basically says, actually, let me give you my favorite quote, because then you can kind of see from that chapter on hope in Mere Christianity. He says, if I find within myself desires that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation was that I was made for another world. So within that, you can probably discern the argument. And it would go something like, for every natural desire, there's a corresponding object that satisfies it. Yep. Here. There's thirst, therefore there's water, and so on. There's desires for sex, therefore there's relationships and all that. You know, and this is how Lewis says it. So that's would be a first premise. Second premise would be very simple. There's one particular desire, this desire for transcendence, I'll call it, but it's sometimes just people call it the longing for God, that nothing in this world can satisfy. Therefore, there's some natural desire that has an object for its satisfaction that is not of this world, and then you kind of have to consider candidate objects that are beyond this world, and I think the most plausible candidate object, given the phenomenology or the feel of that desire, is God, so you can kind of tighten it up. But there's actually a pretty good argument from this one particular desire to the reality of an object that satisfies that desire, which is God. And so here's where the argument gets even more powerful. If you think about our desires as an inverted triangle, just imagine all your desires, put them in a little group, and then think of the shape as an inverted triangle. At the top, you've got surface desires, like right now I'm hungry, thinking about a hamburger that I'll have that for tonight for dinner. These are surface desires. Once I have that hamburger, that desire is gone. But as you go down that triangle, you get to the deeper desires, and those would be desires for love and beauty and knowledge and meaning and happiness. And if you go all the way to the bottom of this triangle, you get the deepest longings of every human heart. And that longing, in fact, would be or is God. As Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they find rest in God. So what Lewis does in the chapter on hope is he goes for that bottom desire, this longing for God, and gives this argument. What's so interesting, he goes one up to beauty in the weight of glory, and he gives the argument from desire from this longing for beauty, which again is just one step above the deepest longing. But if you trace that one for Lewis, for everyone in the tradition, you're going to get to the transcendent reality that is God. So you can use this for, just asking simple questions in our evangelism and apologetics, what is it that you want? Not for dinner, but what is it that you want most deeply in life? And from there, you just awaken these deeper longings, and you're kind of moving down that triangle to the thing that can actually satisfy it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's just, my brain just isn't wired to think that way. Yeah. But you're helping it.
Okay, that's good.
That would explain perhaps why Jesus seems to say, when he calls his disciples, not what do you believe,
that's right,
or what do you know, he says, what do you want?
That's right.
Well, I guess there's a sense then it's what you're really asking people to do is concentrate on what they worship.
Yeah, right.
And what is it they love the most?
That's right. And is the object, does the object that you think will satisfy actually satisfy? And so in the appendix to Pilgrim's Regress, C.S. Lewis talks about this dialectic of desire. He says, we have these longings, and then we tether them to objects that we think will satisfy, and then we realize it doesn't, so we untether, and then we look at something else, and we retether, and he says, and then we untether, and he says, if we follow this dialectic, it's like he said, this is actually what he says, it's kind of like an ontological argument that leads you to the true object of your longing, which is God. So it is very existential, right, that you can actually press this argument in a way that actually matters to the life that we all live on the ground, as opposed to the other arguments for God that just walk, from the universe as an empirical premise to the existence of a God who is behind the universe. Those are fun too, but this one has a different texture to it because you're plumbing something internal to your person that you're talking to.
And it might not feel as solid because of that, but I feel like you said, it would have such a stronger pull.
Yeah,
because I think everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think for me and my brother and I played ice hockey growing up, and I without question, in retrospect, I look back and there's no question that was a substitute for me, for affirmation.
That's right.
For affirmation and for a sense of, you use the word, I don't know, self-worth,
meaning, purpose, identity,
and but it failed me.
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which it would crush me, because if I had a bad game, it's like I would lose all of my meaning and purpose, and and it would just completely unravel. It didn't balance me.
Yeah. It's not meant to bear the weight of that deep longing for
Exactly.
meaning or significance.
And that's why you would say whatever we say best explains that deeper bottom triangle, deep longing, has got to have the ability to to ground that.
Yeah.
And so God would, especially the Christian God, would be something that, I don't know how quite to say this, it's kind of new territory for my mind. Where when I do succeed, I don't get arrogant and lose my sense of humility. I don't sort of overextend my self-worth and my but when I do fail, I also don't lose it entirely, given the grace. And it's a balanced.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, Lewis would put it this way. He says, God gives us the happiness there is, not the happiness there isn't. And then he says, in the end, we only have two options. We can either be like God and enjoy his gifts in creaturely response, or, the two ways, or we can eternally starve. And I think that's like the end of the dialectic truly followed, right? We either become like God and enjoy his gifts, all the gifts he gives us, the water, the food, the bikes, everything, in creaturely response, or we become disintegrated. And so that's very consistent with the two ways to live that you see in Scripture as well. And you're arriving at these conclusions through these deep-seated longings, though, for happiness, for purpose, for meaning. So.
And would you say that maybe hell and heaven are just those microscripts written long?
That's right.
And that would...
Yeah. Yeah, and Lewis was very clear. His even his account of hell, since I happen to be teaching on these topics right now in my philosophical theology class, he held to what's called the choice model of hell, where God basically respects us to the end and gives us over to what our free will wants. And so it's called this choice model, or the natural consequence of a life lived apart from God is that God respects us to the end. So he famously says in that chapter, the chapter on hell, in A Problem of Pain, he says that the doors are locked from the inside. And the idea is that it's psychologically impossible for these free but damned creatures to find any motivating reason to do anything but remain, with their fist up to God and therefore in hell. And this would be a traditional way to articulate. And then heaven would be the reverse of that, life lived leaning into Christ and cultivating the kind of person, the redeemed person who develops character such that, eventually we will be perfected creatures that are free, yet we cannot sin, and will enjoy God's, happiness forever in this perfect unity in heaven or the afterlife. And so, the two ways of living. Yeah.
And there's a sense, would you say perhaps that the end trajectory for each is sort of that bottom desire going unfulfilled eternally and then being fulfilled eternally?
Yeah. And this is why, even in Scripture, Paul is in great pains. I'm always struck with Galatians 4:19, where he says, I'm in the pains of childbirth for the people he was writing to until Christ is formed in you. Just because, we're either leaning toward Christ and becoming conformed into the image of Christ, or we're leaning sort of away from Christ and being conformed into the image of self or the world or whatever kind of disintegration we might find out there.
Yeah, so essentially the crime is the punishment.
I think so.
When you say,
that's one way.
No, God, you get
what you want. Yeah.
I guess that's what Paul says in Romans 1 over and over again. Anyway, he just kind of left them unto their own loves.
Yeah.
Okay, if we could put it that way.
Yeah. Turned them over to those, or Now there's more that there's a larger debate. Since we happen to be talking about heaven and hell, there's a larger debate about justice and penalty or punishment and all that. But at least I think it's clear that there is this kind of natural consequence that's part of that story on the traditional view, and that seems right to me, given the kind of creatures we are.
So I could make an argument for desire. Is there another way to kind of bring up those desires?
With desires? Yeah. So you're right. So you could just hey, there's this really interesting argument.
I could appeal to reason.
You could appeal to reason.
Yeah.
And you could give the argument from reason to God, or argument from desire to God, or any other argument. But you could also just ask a question, and it's the question you mentioned earlier, the one that was Jesus' first question to the would-be disciples. What is it that you want? That's actually a great question in evangelism and apologetics. And just press that question. What is it that you're willing to patiently pursue, at the deepest level? And I think those kinds of questions open up the doors sometimes, I don't want to say just as effectively, but they could be, depending on the person, as effective as well.
Well, it gives the gospel more of a chance of a hearing.
Right.
Right. If we can kind of show, perhaps even for ourselves, just a self-check is just, what is it that I'm looking to get meaning and purpose and fulfillment from, and happiness and satisfaction? And is it giving me that? And if not, am I willing to look elsewhere? But would you recommend using more stories? Is that a way to maybe awaken the desires a little bit more? Sometimes we always think of arguments and presenting evidence, but is there a better approach, or maybe not a better, but just a one more fitting to our cultural moment?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that, because that's some of the work that I've been doing is on story and a theology of story. And I think that the quick answer is yes. In fact, so in my book, Cultural Apologetics, when I wrote in 2019, I argued that there's two ways that we can join with God to re-enchant the world. And the two ways were, which I've already mentioned them, but the first way is that we as Christians would learn to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And then number two, that we would invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And those two suggestions are two future book projects. Okay. The second one of which I've just written and released about a year ago. I wrote a book called A Good and True Story. Yep. And what I did there, that's not a work about cultural apologetics. That's a work of cultural apologetics. And what I think is unique about it is three kind of theses that I bring to that work. And real quickly, a thesis about reality, a thesis about humans, and a thesis about evidence. The thesis about reality is that reality is a kind of story. So I think that that's actually the structure of reality. If you think of Calvin, the heavens are a dazzling theater of God's glory. If you think of like the traditional Christian account, everything's from God, and everything one day returns to God. There's a kind of narrative arc to that. So the second thesis, though, is that humans, too, are narratival animals, that we live according to a story. We come into this world as part and take up our place in the ongoing story. And then the third piece about evidence was this idea that evidence is widely available but easily resistible, so we need help. We need help interpreting the evidence. And so I wrote a story. I should say I wrote a book taking a reader on a journey looking at the question of origin, destiny, and quest. These are the three great questions that story asks. And looking at the evidence, but basically did it by telling stories, by referencing literature and culture and movies and my own personal journey and things like that. Because I do think that story is incredibly important. And so you have lots of people today writing on the intersection of apologetics and story. So it's a great question. Yeah.
Not everyone is thinking syllogistically. Nobody is thinking syllogistically.
Except for philosophers, maybe. And
yeah, that's the anthropology we assume of ourselves and the people we're sharing the gospel with can be wrong. I would say for myself has been wrong in the past. Yeah. You know, I think James K. Smith talks about how we look at people like bobbleheads.
That's right.
You know, these big brains walking on a stick, and that's not really how we are. That's maybe how we like to see ourselves.
Yeah, right.
But I don't know if you read anything by Jonathan Haidt.
I'm a little bit of The Anxious Generation. I haven't read The Righteous Mind yet, but that's on my radar too.
So I'd be curious. I was just curious if you agreed with him that our emotions are probably stronger than our more rational cognitive faculties, and that there's a sense in which we rationalize what we want.
Okay, that does
more often.
That does sound
and that's
good.
our disposition. And if that's the case, then your approach should perhaps be fronted. Yeah.
Right, because you do the runaround and get to the heart, to the longings and the desires and the emotions. Yeah, I mean that comment by Jonathan Haidt sounds consistent with kind of how I'm viewing people in culture today. Yeah. If we are, even if, like as James K. Smith says, if we think of ourselves as heads on a stick, they would be very thin heads today. We're very anti-intellectual, even in the church, but in culture in general. But yet we are moved by that which we think will satisfy, and so the emotions sometimes do take front and center. Now, I think, on my view, though, the emotions are super important, but we do have to have a proper view of what they are. And the more that I've been thinking on what the emotions are and the important role they play, again, I don't mean to keep coming back to Lewis. I guess he just saw things clearly, but he talks about the emotions as these kind of quasi-perceptual faculties that help us to perceive value. and they can be congruent or incongruent with reality. So there is actually
Almost
properly
like a
understood
propositional kind of content to them.
Well, there
Like
is
a
some
truth value to
There
them?
is close. There is some intellect. There is some content. So
Okay.
if I'm angry, say that somebody spilled milk, and I'm angry over spilled milk.
Yeah.
So there's some content, but there's also a affective reaction there.
Yeah.
And in that case, the emotion is incongruous with reality. Like, really, should you really be like angry about spilled milk?
Yeah.
In fact, there's a phrase: "Don't cry over spilled milk." But on the other hand, if I'm not jealous, say someone's flirting with my wife, and I'm just not jealous, there would be an emotion that's also incongruous with reality because I'm not perceiving the value of the situation accurately. So the emotions actually play a huge
They
role.
make contact with reality.
do,
They're
right.
not as subjective as we think they are.
I don't think so. I think
Yeah.
that they help us see more
See
value,
truth.
see value, and yeah, the truth. They're like if reality is composed of like facts and value, it's the thing that helps us to see the value of things. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah.
I could pick your brain forever,
Yeah,
but I'm
well,
not going to.
No, that's okay. This is fun. The thing I will say,
Appreciate you.
in writing the book, Cultural Apologetics, I just said it. We want to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does, and delight is an emotion. And I realized, I was actually talking to a friend of mine who teaches at the Air Force Academy in Colorado after the book was released. He's an expert on Lewis, and he did his PhD on the emotions at Baylor. And he was talking about this idea that Lewis held about the emotions, and it just dawned on me there, like a year after the book was released, I didn't say a word about the emotions. So in the last 5 years since the book, I've been studying the emotions, and I've realized, so when I write this other book that I want to write on re-enchantment, this will be a big part of it because they are central. But we just got to understand how they function in a flourishing life. So,
Okay.
yeah, excited for that.